In Ohio, Curtis finds himself gazing at the immense clouds overhead, standing in the pouring rain. Confusion settles over him as he notices that instead of water, it's motor oil falling from the sky. But then, he jolts awake. It was just a dream, and the day outside is beautiful. After shaking off the bizarre nightmare, Curtis joins his wife Samantha and their deaf daughter Hannah for breakfast before heading off to work. Curtis is employed by a construction company, while Samantha, a stay-at-home mom, cares for Hannah and works on her craft projects, which she sells at the local fair each Saturday. Later in the afternoon, Samantha is spending time with some friends at their house, their children playing together, when one of the moms notices Hannah dangerously handling a piece of wood with protruding nails. Since yelling won't help, Samantha rushes out to stop her. As the day progresses, a heavy downpour forces Curtis and his construction crew to pause their work, prompting them to gather for drinks at the local bar. Meanwhile, back home, Samantha shows Hannah how to sign the word for storm as they watch the rain from the window. After leaving the bar, Curtis gives his close friend and colleague Duarte a ride home. They chat for a while, and Duarte remarks on how great Curtis' life seems. Curtis, however, admits it's not as perfect as it looks. Their conversation is cut short when Duarte's wife steps outside, insisting he come inside. When Curtis gets home, he checks in on Hannah. Samantha shares her concerns that Hannah is struggling to connect with other children. The next day, while Curtis tidies up around the house to make sure Hannah doesn't grab anything dangerous again, the sky darkens and a sudden storm breaks out. A lightning bolt strikes the ground nearby, spooking Curtis' dog, Red, who breaks free from his chain and violently bites Curtis on the arm. Curtis suddenly wakes up. It's yet another nightmare. At breakfast, Curtis can't shake the vivid memory of the dream. Watching Hannah play with Red, worry overtakes him, and he pulls her away from the dog. Samantha asks what's wrong, but Curtis brushes her off and leaves for work, skipping his meal. At the construction site, he remains distracted, constantly rubbing his arm where the dog had bitten him in the dream. During a meeting, his boss Jim, irritated by the delays from the previous day's rain, insists they catch up on lost time. Curtis asks Duarte to help grab some extra supplies, but later, while on a break, Curtis spots a swarm of blackbirds flying in unusual patterns. When he points it out to Duarte, Duarte dismisses it, having seen nothing unusual. Because of the extended work hours, Curtis ends up running late for a parent-teacher conference at Hannah's school. Arriving covered in mud from the site, Curtis feels self-conscious as they learn more sign language to better communicate with Hannah. Curtis struggles to keep up, realizing he doesn't know as many signs as Samantha, who spends more time with their daughter. A few days later, Curtis and Hannah are caught in another storm while rushing to get into the car. The downpour limits visibility, causing Curtis to lose control and crash. Bleeding from his head, Curtis checks on Hannah, relieved that she's unharmed. Suddenly, strange men appear outside the car, breaking the windows. One holds Curtis down while the other kidnaps Hannah. Curtis screams, then wakes up, his heart racing, realizing it's another nightmare. Shaken, Curtis heads downstairs, feeling ill. Samantha notices his distress, but Curtis assures her it's just a cold and urges her to go to the fair with Hannah. As Samantha sells her goods at the fair, Curtis sets about using the supplies he had gathered at work to build a fence around Red's doghouse, locking the dog inside and apologizing for the harsh treatment. Instead of cleaning up the rest of the yard, Curtis becomes preoccupied with a storm shelter nearby, eventually retrieving the key from an old jar to inspect it. That evening, Samantha places the money she made at the fair into their vacation savings jar. Curious about why Red is now being kept outside, she questions Curtis, but he gives a vague response and turns his attention to the news. A report about a gas leak affecting a local family only heightens his growing paranoia. The following morning, Curtis finds Hannah staring out the window at an approaching storm. As he walks over to her, he is startled to spot a figure standing outside, watching them. In a panic, Curtis grabs Hannah and retreats to hide as the man tries to force his way in. The house begins to shake violently, and objects around the room float into the air while Curtis struggles to breathe. Just as suddenly, everything falls and Curtis wakes up from yet another nightmare, shocked to find he's wet the bed. When Samantha enters the room, Curtis hurriedly hides the evidence under the blankets. He asks her for the doctor's number, but when she expresses concern, Curtis angrily rebuffs her, trying to keep her from discovering the wet sheets. Curtis, overwhelmed by his outburst, quickly apologizes to Samantha, blaming it on not feeling well. He urges her to go to church, assuring her that he can manage things at home with Hannah. After she leaves, Curtis goes to work covering his tracks, changing the sheets and washing away any evidence of the accident. Later, he takes Hannah to the library, distracting her with a children's book while he dives into researching mental illness, desperately seeking answers for what he's been experiencing. On the way back, they stop at a grocery store and Curtis stocks up on canned foods. They arrive late for lunch with Hannah's family, who judge him for skipping church. In the afternoon, Curtis begins cleaning the storm shelter, preparing it for emergencies by storing the canned food. Lost in his own world, he spends hours down there, reading the books he borrowed from the library. Days later, Curtis finally consults a doctor, explaining that he hasn't been able to sleep for 4 nights. Initially, the doctor doesn't seem too concerned, but when Curtis describes the vivid nightmares, the bedwetting, and the lingering pain from the dog bite, the doctor agrees to prescribe some medication and refers him to a psychiatrist in Columbus. Meanwhile, Samantha visits an insurance agency to inquire about an operation to restore Hannah's hearing. To her relief, the insurance policy Curtis holds through his job covers the procedure. Curtis, on the other hand, visits the pharmacy to pick up his medication and is pleasantly surprised that it's affordable, thanks to the same policy. That evening, the family enjoys dinner together, celebrating the good news about Hannah's upcoming surgery. However, Curtis chooses not to mention his medication, keeping it to himself. As Samantha enthusiastically discusses vacation plans, Curtis sneaks away to take his pills in secret. The next morning, Curtis wakes up feeling refreshed for the first time in days. Samantha notices the improvement, commenting on how much healthier he looks. Yet, despite this newfound sense of calm, Curtis can't shake his fixation on the storm shelter. At work, he confides in Duarte about his plans, asking how much food would be enough to store for an emergency. Suddenly, Curtis hears thunder in the distance, even though the sky is clear. He turns to Duarte, who doesn't hear anything, and panic sets in. Rushing to a nearby bin, Curtis throws up, overwhelmed by anxiety. As Curtis drives home, his panic escalates, making it difficult for him to breathe. He pulls over, takes a moment to regain control, and spots a store selling containers, perfect for expanding his shelter. Driven by a new idea, Curtis purchases one. Later, he visits his mother, who has been heavily medicated for years due to her paranoid schizophrenia, which developed around Curtis's current age. His fear that he might be following in her footsteps leads him to ask questions, but she struggles to recall much from those difficult years. Worried about driving to Columbus for a psychiatric appointment, Curtis contacts his doctor, requesting another option. That night, he sits down to calculate the costs of transforming his shelter into a full bunker. The next morning, without telling Samantha, he visits the bank and takes out a home improvement loan, ignoring his agent's warnings about the risks. Back at work, Curtis seeks Duarte's help again, this time asking for equipment to build the bunker, a request that bends the company's rules. Duarte, concerned for his friend, agrees, but questions Curtis's well-being. Curtis brushes off the concerns, insisting everything is fine. Later, Curtis sees a local counselor, pouring out his worries about his family history, his mother's mental illness, and his disturbing dreams. Though the counselor can't diagnose him, she listens patiently, offering to help him through his crisis. On their way back from another school meeting that evening, Curtis suddenly stops the car. In the distance, he sees flashes of lightning, though the rest of his family remains asleep and no other drivers seem to react. His concerns about his mental health deepen, fueling his growing anxiety. On Saturday, while Samantha and Hannah attend the fair, Curtis and Duarte begin working on the shelter. When Samantha returns and sees what Curtis has been up to, a heated argument erupts. Furious, Samantha demands answers, especially after discovering Curtis took out a loan without telling her. She's also angry about his strange behavior, like locking up Red. Curtis, feeling cornered, refuses to explain, walking away to check on Hannah as Samantha breaks down in tears. That night, Curtis takes more medication than prescribed, hoping to quiet his troubled mind. Hours later, Samantha awakens to find Curtis seizing and bleeding beside her. Panicked, she immediately calls for an ambulance, ignoring Curtis's weak protests that it isn't necessary. After the paramedics depart, Curtis finally opens up to Samantha, sharing everything he's been keeping inside. He promises her that he's committed to seeing the counselor regularly because he refuses to abandon his family like his mother did. The following day, the couple takes Hannah to the hospital for a checkup, and they receive good news. Her surgery is scheduled in 6 weeks. At work, Curtis approaches his boss, Jim, requesting that Duarte be removed from his crew, as he feels uncomfortable giving orders to his best friend. Though Jim finds the request odd, he agrees, but warns Curtis that his recent absences from work haven't gone unnoticed. Curtis explains that the missed days were due to Hannah's medical appointments, but Jim still issues a formal warning. Later that day, Curtis visits a store to purchase gas masks, shocked at how expensive they are. Meanwhile, Samantha hears rumors about Curtis' behavior from Duarte's wife, but firmly defends her husband, assuring her that they are managing just fine. A few days later, Curtis is in the middle of working on the storm shelter when his brother Kyle shows up, having heard about Curtis' increasingly erratic behavior from Samantha. Kyle is visibly worried, but Curtis dismisses his concerns, insisting everything is under control. The brothers share a strained, awkward relationship, and before Kyle leaves, Curtis remembers that he had been searching for a new home for Red and asks Kyle to take the dog with him. On a stormy afternoon, Curtis walks into the kitchen to find Samantha drenched from the rain. They exchange a tense look, and for a moment, Curtis imagines her reaching for a knife, only to wake up from another disturbing dream. At breakfast, still rattled by the nightmare, Curtis pulls away when Samantha reaches for his hand. Their attention is soon drawn to Jim, waiting outside the house. Curtis rushes out to meet him, only to be hit with devastating news. Jim has discovered that Curtis borrowed company equipment without permission, and as a result, Curtis is fired, with just 2 weeks of medical insurance left. Duarte is also suspended for 2 weeks without pay for his involvement. Curtis breaks the news to Samantha, who, in a fit of frustration, slaps him before storming out of the room with Hannah. Seeking some guidance, Curtis heads to his counselor's office, only to find a new therapist has taken her place. The new counselor suggests starting from scratch, but Curtis, frustrated at the thought of rehashing old wounds, especially about his mother, leaves without saying a word. He retreats to the shelter and continues working, consumed by the need to prepare for the storm he believes is coming. As financial pressures mount, Samantha begins taking on extra sewing jobs for neighbors, but it's not enough. She reluctantly dips into their vacation savings to cover bills. That evening, the couple has a tense conversation where Curtis explains that his earlier reaction at breakfast was because of a dream. He holds her hand, reassuring her that he's working through his issues. Samantha announces that they will have to cancel their beach trip, using Curtis's final paycheck to cover 2 months of expenses. She also proposes postponing Hannah's surgery, emphasizing that their priority should be finding new jobs. Samantha is willing to work on their marriage, but only if Curtis agrees to see a psychiatrist and attend the upcoming school dinner to reconnect with their community. On the night of the school event, Curtis is confronted by Duarte, who blames Curtis for his suspension. Despite Curtis's attempts to calm him down and suggest a private conversation, Duarte escalates, accusing Curtis of cutting him off when they were supposed to be friends. Things get heated, with Duarte pushing and punching Curtis, who retaliates by kicking him back. In a moment of pure frustration, Curtis snaps, flipping a table and shouting about the impending storm that no one is prepared for. He breaks down in front of everyone, and Samantha seizes the opportunity to take him home. Later, Curtis dreams again, this time of seeing Hannah in the middle of the road, surrounded by birds flying in strange patterns before they drop dead to the ground. Just as the tension mounts, Curtis awakens to the sound of a real-life siren wailing. It's raining heavily outside, and Curtis grabs his family, leading them to the storm shelter. Inside, they put on oxygen masks, unsure of what's happening. Curtis stays on edge, convinced the storm is still raging outside. When morning comes, Samantha gently tries to convince Curtis to open the door, insisting that the storm has passed. Curtis, however, refuses, claiming he can still feel it. He even asks Samantha to touch the door, certain she'll feel the vibrations too. But Samantha feels nothing. Desperate and afraid, Curtis hands her the key, urging her to open the door herself. Samantha refuses, reminding Curtis that facing his fears is something only he can do. Mustering the courage, Curtis opens the door to reveal a bright, sunny day. The neighbors are out, cleaning up debris from the storm, and everything is calm. Sometime later, Samantha takes Curtis to a psychiatrist. After a thorough consultation, the doctor increases Curtis's medication and recommends that he spend time away from the shelter. He advises the family to take a short break to rest and prepare for Curtis to be admitted to a specialized facility for recovery, meaning he'll be away from his family for some time. The next day, Curtis, Samantha, and Hannah are at the beach. Curtis and Hannah are building a sandcastle when Hannah signs the word storm and points toward the sea. Samantha walks out, only to witness what Curtis feared. The sky is darkening, and it begins to rain oil. As the family looks out over the water, a massive, dark storm looms in the distance. Curtis turns to Samantha, and she nods, confirming that she sees it too. And that wraps up the haunting psychological thriller about Curtis' descent into fear and paranoia, battling his terrifying visions of a storm that no one else can see. As the lines between reality and delusion blur, the film's gripping exploration of mental illness, family, and survival leaves us questioning whether Curtis' fears were all in his mind or something more. What did you think of this tense, slow burn drama? Was Curtis truly seeing the future, or was it all just a figment of his troubled mind? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next review. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.